What's up, everybody? Welcome back. We're here with some more PGA DFS picks and lineup advice for DraftKings and FanDuel. This time for the Sony Open out in Honolulu, Hawaii. Welcome. I'm Brian Jester, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy, and I'm joined by a fellow six-figure PGA DFS winner. It is Niromada, our PGA DFS analyst at Occupy Fantasy. Niro, happy second week of the season. How are you?
I'm good. Looking to bounce back from what would have been a six-figure loser last week had I played at that type of volume level, which I do not, thankfully, after last week.
Exactly. So what we're going to do in this video, for those who are returning from last week's video, welcome back. Those of you who are new, glad to have you. We will analyze a little bit. We don't want to harp too long on last week's event, but we always think it's important to see if we can learn anything from last week's selections. So we will review some of our picks and plays from last week. Then we will move to what our data model is telling us for the Sony Open, who are the best data-driven plays. You guys liked this segment last week, and we'll add some FanDuel plays as well, but we will talk about which players that, if you're playing in really small or low dollar contests and you don't have much information, these are guys that should be popular and will be more popular because of some very popular industry projections that are predictable or predictive. And if you're playing higher dollar stuff, understand that these players, these high stake bump guys, will be higher owned than what any projected ownership will indicate, and that'll be useful in your contest. And then this week, because it is a full cut event and it's the first full field event of the new year, we'll have some Corn Ferry guys and some DP World Tour guys. So Nero and I will give some favorite names that you may not know that haven't been on the PGA Tour for this Sony Open. And then, of course, we like to get the leverage from pivoting off the popular cheap players. We'll give you who those guys are and then a couple names that you can look to play in high-risk contests as a direct pivot away from those popular players. So Nero, let's start with last week's review of the Century. Always difficult coming off a break, and especially with a no-cut event. But the model was pretty spot on last week. Our data-driven model at Occupy Fantasy. Ludwig Oberg was number 3 in the model. He finished top 5. Colin Morikawa was number 4. Not a big, reward here for having these guys in our top 5, but they did finish in the top 5. Morikawa finished second. Harry Hall, who was the cover boy of the video last week, was top 5 in our model, finished top 8 at the Century. Corey Connors was 7th in our model, he finished top 5, and then Sam Burns was 8th in our model and finished top 8. So pretty good week for the model if you use most of those plays. Now, Niromada in our daily plug at occupyfantasy.com gives some of his picks that are data-driven, more subjective factors, betting market-driven. And let's not sugarcoat it, Niro. Not the best week of the year for your picks in the daily plug last week. And that's not to call you out by any means. We always think it's important to look back. Did we miss anything? And it's also important for us to be transparent because we're not going to sit and lie to you guys and act like we have magic 8 balls and time machines where we can accurately predict the future every single week. So, Nero, missed some guys in the plug last week. Was there anything that you would do differently or anything you may have missed? Or can we just chalk it up to some variance?
It reminds me of the quote by one of the investment gurus: "He who lives by the crystal ball will die by the shattered glass." That's basically what it was last week. So first of all, on the transparency piece, if you are an Occupy subscriber and you read the plug every week, I keep track and have kept track for as many years as I've written the plug of how my picks do, plus or minus, compared to what their expected fantasy points were for the salary that they were given in DFS. You're not going to find that, I don't think, from any other content provider that I've read. So I'm very into the transparency. Some weeks I line up well with the model. Some weeks I'm against the model, and some weeks, I do really well and I beat the model. And last week the model just whipped me. I had Thigala, he finished 36th. Harmon was 58th, which was DFL. Malnati was 53rd. Schauffele was 30th. Anyway, to wrap it up, I leaned in pretty heavily to the short game creativity angle, and as you could tell by the top of the leaderboard, it was much more of a ball strikers week. I think part of that started in the first part of the week when the wind was more than I expected it to be. And anytime it's wind, the conditions are harder. It's going to be more of a ball strikers event rather than a short game specialist event. And so, need to pay closer attention to that. And then might just need to tweak my thoughts a little bit going forward for this event and not lean so much into the creativity and the short game angle that I've historically played here.
Love to hear that. And by the way, I do have the daily plug pulled up on screen. You can see Nero's historical plug performance here if you're not a member at OccupyFantasy.com. And basically, how we judge his picks are what a player should have scored on DraftKings based on their salary, and then compare it to what they actually scored. And the past 2 years specifically, Nero's picks have scored more than 1,000 points more than expected. And he's never had below a 500 or 600 point positive points over expected season. So he knows what he's doing. We're going to have some bad weeks from time to time, but we're going to get back on track with the plug picks for the Sony Open this week. Nero, let's transition to our Occupy model, data driven. It takes a look at what should be important at a course and tries to predict who will be the top players. And again, you're going to see some really weird names sometimes, right? We're not just automatically pumping out the top salary guy. Like Hideki might be the top in most models this week. He's number 7 in our model this week. So I'll give you guys the top 7 or 8. Nero, I'll say the name and you give me a stat or a reason or two that either the model is high on them or people should be playing them this week in DFS. And I'm going to pull up the DraftKings page here so people can see their player cards as well. Number 1 in our model this week, one of the cheapest players in the field, is Keith Mitchell at 7,300. Nero, so Keith Mitchell, give me a quick sentence or two.
Yeah, outstanding ball striker. First in off the tee on shorter courses. The pause for concern is he missed his last 4 cuts going into end the year. Before that, though, he was 3rd, 12th, and 12th in the 3 events before that. So high risk, high reward for Mitchell.
And unfortunately, and we'll talk about this in the final section, he will be popular. And that's not the type of player you want high risk, high reward on. So we'll talk about maybe a pivot away from the
Correct.
model. So
Correct.
next, number 2 in the model, JJ Spawn, who, by the way, one of the best features of our model that I truly love is the putting variance. And you can't see it on the front end, but basically the model looks at how a player should have performed based on their putts. Are they getting luckier on longer putts? Are they missing shorter putts? Are they getting better at shorter putts? And the numbers aren't following. JJ Spawn is one of the biggest gainers in our putting variance metric. Why else? Because that alone is not going to get you the top 2 in the model, Nero. Why else would JJ Spawn pop this week?
Yeah, he's got a good all around game, and he's a very good ball striker usually. So he's for this type of a course, being solid in multiple categories is a good thing. He was also 12th here 2 years ago, which I know the model doesn't take into too much account, but he does have 4 of his last 5 cuts here were missed cuts. So there's your downside to Spawn this week for your risk and reward section.
And that's why we love looking at the model and then some subjective factors around it as well to give you some context to the play. Next, we have who will be a popular player around the industry is Ben On, who is $9,400, the first expensive guy that's ranking this high in the model. I mean, lots of reasons to like him this week, but why is everyone on Ben On this week?
Well, so he knocked the rust off last week at the Century. Played okay, finished in the middle of the pack. But in addition to like all of his good ball striking metrics, he has a recent win at the Genesis in Korea where he finished first. And his last 2 starts here, which I believe are his only 2 starts here, he's finished 2nd and 12th at the course. So you've got recent performance plus positive course history plus a lot of good stats. Anytime you combine that together, that player is going to be popular.
Well, we love to see that. Next, we have Ben Griffin at 8,200. Again, maybe a surprise. And again, if you're not truly into PGA DFS, you may even be like, who is Ben Griffin? So what's the data behind Ben Griffin ranking so high?
So he's a good short course player. He's got some good history at coastal venues. Maybe not something that everyone looks at all the time, but he's very good in the mid iron area, and this course requires a ton of mid iron approach shots. Because the course is tight, short, and has a lot of dog legs, it kind of forces people to hit from the same areas. So even though it's a short course, you end up with more mid irons than you do wedges. So players who are really good with their mid irons can tend to stand out here, and that's Griffin. And he was also 30th and 12th in his last 2 starts here. So clearly can handle the course.
That's some really, really good insight there about ball positioning and where players will be hitting from. Next, we have Chan Kim, 6,900 on DraftKings. And again, maybe another surprise here, Nero.
Yeah, Kim actually came on pretty well at the end of last year. He's an inconsistent player as a whole, but he can go really low, and he has numerous high finishes. Relative to who he is, I suppose, as a player. Good around the green. Another one like Mitchell who ranks pretty highly off the tee in short courses. And when I look through his history here, for the downside, not good. So he's played here twice and he's missed the cut both times, including last year. Now, but again, the perfect encapsulation of him. What he shoot in his 2 rounds last year here, 75 to Open, and then 64 in round 2. That's like Chan Kim in a nutshell.
Oh man, yeah, that is. I mean, when you're playing a guy like that and you're following those rounds, it's maddening how that could possibly happen on back-to-back days. But if you've ever played golf, you know that is damn sure possible. And finally, to close out the top 7 of the model is Mac Meisner, 7,100. Looks like another good mid-iron player.
Yes, Meisner is very good with his mid irons. Another one who's also positive off the tee on short courses and played well in the fall. Like I think I was looking through, he had one missed cut at the Pro Core, but otherwise he was in the top 40 in 4 of those 5 fall events that he played. His downside is he's not played here before, and this course is typically not kind to first timers.
So we have a lot of guys in the top 7 of the model that rank pretty highly in the metrics we desire at this course, but a lot of subjective factors that make them potentially risky. And it is a high risk, high reward model. So I guess, Nero, my question to you is, unlike last week where there was a lot of guys at the top of the model who we felt great about, and there wasn't much downside, especially in a no-cut event, but would you tread lightly this week with the model, or would you just be cognizant of how many of these high risk, high reward guys are using in a specific lineup?
Yeah, to me, it's all about lineup construction. So, I tend to be a little bit more of a feel based player when it comes to golf DFS, even though I lean in probably a little heavier on the data side for other sports. And I would not want to have, five guys that are high risk outputs type players in one single lineup. Like I would be looking to mix maybe 1 or 2 of those players from the top of the model into a lineup that had more stability in other places. So maybe mixed into a lineup that had a Ben on in there, someone who's very stable at that type of a price point. That would be the type of thing that I would be looking for. It's like lineup construction for me is the way to solve that problem rather than any other way.
That's some really good context to how to use the model specifically for this week when we have guys like this at the top of the board. All right, now speaking of ownership, speaking of guys that are higher owned, let's move on to the high stakes bumps section. These are guys that if you're playing any contest that pros are allowed to play, so $3 or higher, and or you're playing smaller contests with large entry fees. These are guys that, based on the industry projections that we've tracked over time, cause a significant bump in ownership than what you'll see in our model or any projected ownership. So you have to be cognizant. And if you have no access to any models, you have no access to any projections, and you're playing contests that are less than $3, just use these guys because they're good plays historically. So we'll go DraftKings and FanDuel. I'll name the guys if you just want to point out maybe 1 or 2 of them or a stat or something, Nero. But here are the guys on DraftKings, the guys we expect to be more popular than expected. Andrew Novak, $7,400. We haven't talked about him yet. Chris Kirk, winner of the Century last year. Denny McCarthy, known good putter, also from Maryland, by the way. Sepp Straka, known to go low from time to time at 8K. And then Davis Thompson, who is a pretty good person to mention as we talk about the Korn Ferry and DP World Tour guys because he had a high finish in January last year at low ownership. Those are the guys we look to replicate when no one knows about them or we don't have enough data on them. We'll talk about those guys in a second here, though. So of Novak, Kirk, McCarthy, Straka, and Davis Thompson, anyone stand out or any interesting facts about these 5 that will be more popular than people think?
Yeah, well, if you just looking at the 5 of them, 4 of the 5 of them, all of them except for Novak played last week, so they kind of got the rust off. There's a lot of good data that shows, players playing last week play well in the Sony Open. Now, that could easily be just because like who plays in the Century Tournament of
Right. The
Champions?
good
Well,
players.
generally the good players and the best players on tour. So it would make sense if they would then go and overperform the next week at the Sony. But I think that narrative, factors in number one, that data flows in, so that's a positive data, and then some of that narrative flows in with the field also. So those players tend to get clicked more often than anyone else. I will say Novak was very, very good in the fall. He was 35th at the RSM, second at the Bermuda, and 16th at the Zozo in Japan. And that's all stuff that was basically from November. Well, in the month of November, and Zozo was the very end of October. So, not too far away. And he was 12th here 2 years ago. Yeah, 2 years ago in 2023.
Which, by the way, for those of you who are looking through the event logs in a player's profile in DraftKings, they don't necessarily show some of those November events. So you might have to go to a different source to find out how players performed in those late year events last year. Now, if we go over to FanDuel, for you FanDuel players who, in the comments last week, we love to hear from you, said you wanted to see more FanDuel specific talk. Nero, who are the guys this week? I know Davis Thompson and Novak will be popular or more popular over here in smaller contests and high dollar contests. But is there anyone else that sticks out as someone that, oh, wow, this guy's more popular than industry projections might have anticipated?
Yeah, the one that sticks out immediately was Brian Campbell because I had to like go and I pride myself on basically knowing way too much about way too many golfers, and I had to sit and think for a few moments like Brian Campbell, like who's Brian Campbell? And I had to go back through not only my database but some of the other data that I have access to figure out who he is. But he, as you look through the data, very good year on the Corn Ferry Tour last year. He was second at the Corn Ferry Tour Championship in October. A little bit wary of the long layoff and the fact that he's never played. He's never played here before, but statistically, he's a good fit. He's a good fit for the course, and obviously, I think the real reason like he's maybe a little more popular than you would think is good data, good Corn Ferry data, but he's priced at the bottom, of the pricing tier on both sides really, and he probably should be priced up a little bit closer to the bottom of the middle rather than the bottom of the bottom.
That certainly makes sense. So Brian Campbell is a guy that is a great transition to our Corn Ferry and DP World Tour segment. Other guys, by the way, for you FanDuel players that will be popular, or if you're playing in less than $3 contests, just jam these guys in, is Davis Thompson, Andrew Novak. It's Andrew Putnam, Brian Campbell, and Lucas Glover. Always long-term Occupy favorite Lucas Glover. So really quickly, though, before we go into this next segment, last week we did not get 1,000 viewers. We came really close, which is better than we did last year. But as we said in last week's video, if we want to continue this video all season long, we got to see more engagement, and we got to make sure it's worth our time and everyone's time. So if you want to see this video every single week for the rest of the season, we got to get over 1,000 views. What's the best way to do that? Watch this video all the way through, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and put a comment on the video. It could be a question, it could be a prediction, it could be some nice things you have to say about me and Niromada, or bad things. That gets more engagement, honestly, so it's up to you. But if you want to see this video, those are the best ways to help out the channel and to see these videos in the future. So, talked about Brian Campbell, Nero. We have a bunch of guys, and I'm going to pull up the PGA Tour website, and this is how you can tell who's in the field, where they came from. So if we said Brian Campbell and we didn't tell you, and you'd be like, who the hell is Brian Campbell? You can come over to the PGA Tour field page. Just go to pgatour.com, schedule, click the field, and it tells you how guys got into it. And you'll see the top 2 through 30 players on the prior season Corn Ferry Tour points list. And we have like a bunch of guys and a couple from the DP World Tour. And they have basically no data. No matter which database you use, these guys aren't going to have data, and therefore they're going to be mostly low owned. And the average person talking about them or average person playing them is not going to play them. So Nero, why don't you give maybe one or two guys that stick out to you from Corn Ferry or DP World Tour that I think that people might be overlooking?
Yeah, these weeks are tough for me because I really want to like play into my ego and play a bunch of guys that I know a lot about that other people don't. And that usually doesn't go very well because there's a reason why these guys haven't been on the big tour with most of the rest of the players that we're more familiar with. So I've got two from the DP World Tour that I'm very interested in, not only this week but to really pay attention to as we go throughout the year. Rasmus Højgaard is number one, so that's Nikolai's twin brother. If we go back to the plug for, I believe it was the 2020 U.S. Open right after COVID at Winged Foot. I actually wrote Rasmus up in that plug when I think he was 19 years old or 18 years old. He missed the cut by like 1,000. But he's very good. Nikolai we saw last year is very good also, and I think Rasmus is quickly catching up to that level. So very interesting watching him. And then Aldrich Potgieter. I'm not exactly sure how to say his last name. South Africa, young kid, played outstanding amateur golf and was great at the end of the DP World Tour season with the South African events and some of the Australian events. So I think he just absolutely bombs it. So, Sony Open might not be the best fit for him, but someone to pay attention to as we move through the early part of the year.
And by the way, I watched Potgieter's finish on one of the DP World Tour events where he tripled to lose the lead late on day 4. Not that I was financially invested or anything into that outcome, but we know he can go low and contend even with some more experienced players. As for Rasmus, he's not in this event, right? But that's just the guy we should be looking for here in the next couple of weeks.
Correct.
Okay, cool.
Correct.
And then I'll give you 3 names this week that really stood out when I was compiling the model because of how eye-popping their stats were on the Korn Ferry Tour. One is Steven Fisk, who is number 1 in like multiple Korn Ferry stats, which is pretty crazy. He's 6,400 on DraftKings, so Steven Fisk is one guy to watch. Next is Thomas Rosenmuller, who I just assumed was DP World Tour, but he's actually was on the Korn Ferry Tour. He's a German guy, and in his final 7 Korn Ferry starts, he had a win in 4 other top 5s, which is pretty damn good. And finally, we have Isaiah Salindo, who I believe we even talked about on the U.S. Open video last year, Nero, and he did finish top 32 or tie 32 at the U.S. Open, which is pretty good for a guy with not much experience, but big-time collegiate player, has a bunch of great stats, did win once on the Korn Ferry Tour last year. So we have guys here that performed on the Korn Ferry Tour, but also have some other credentials that make them guys we need to watch early on, and maybe even as soon as this event.
Yep, absolutely. Well, Brian knows just because he spends too much time talking about golf stuff with me, but I pay very close attention to players' amateur careers and how quickly they kind of pop up to the top of the amateur scene and what they do when they're up at those high level events. And Celinda was like outstanding, like elite level amateur, very similar to your Morikawa, Wolf, Justin Suh, like that type of stuff. Did very similar things to those guys as an amateur. Now, those guys often don't pan out, but when they do, they're usually very high level professional players. So Celinda at least has that potential, and he showed it early on in his career.
And again, these are guys we're not playing in cash games, but if you're playing multiple tournament lineups, you're not going 50% Isaiah Salindo, but we mix them into a couple lineups, you're already over the field. And that's the way to think about these types of players. All right, we'll close out the show with pivots from popular cheap players. Guys we expect under 8K on DraftKings that will be popular, 15% or higher probably in most contests. But we know historically, despite what our model says, despite what other statistics say, they're not great plays in tournaments because of the inherent variance in golf. Mackenzie Hughes, Denny McCarthy, and Keith Mitchell. And I'm going to put them into the lineup screen here on DraftKings so I don't forget who they are. Mackenzie Hughes, Denny McCarthy, and Keith Mitchell. Keith Mitchell, obviously top of the model. Don't like seeing him high owns there. But Nero, if our viewers and members are looking to play these guys and the rest of their lineup is chalky, or they're just playing pure game theory and contrarian angles, who would you play instead of these 3 that have much lower ownership?
Yeah, my two favorite pivots from those two, right around that same price range, would be Tomas Dietrich, who played last week, very high finish at the Tournament of Champions, very good. I mean, I don't know how he hasn't won yet across either the PGA Tour or the DP World Tour, but I expect that to change this year. And then also Michael Thorbjornsen at 7,400. Again, another outstanding amateur who has turned pro then, during last year and really pro for most of the end of 2024. Would also expect him to be getting a win or very close to one in 2025. So those would be my two favorite pivots in that price range.
You know, Nero cannot get away from a high-ranking amateur, especially one who shows
Oh,
potential as early as Thorbjornsen did. Finished eighth at Sanderson Farm, so it's not just the pedigree here at Nero. I mean, he's put up some results early in his career too.
yeah, absolutely. Look, to try to be good at anything like DFS or a similar endeavor, you have to be aware of your own biases. And I absolutely have a bias towards highly ranked amateurs who have a lot of sauce behind them in the golf world.
All right, guys, that'll do it for this video. We appreciate you watching as always. Nero, do you have a pick to win, or do you have a stud at the top that you're willing to play more than most? I know it's only Tuesday morning, but any initial leans on studs that people should be playing?
Yeah, I think for a more conventional standpoint, it would be Ben On. Absolutely looking to get over the field on Ben On, even though he's going to be somewhat popular, but he's not going to be nearly as popular as the guys at the very top of the price range. And I'm a glutton for punishment, so I'll come right back on top of Tigala this week. Killed himself with a 76 when he opened last week, but if you look at his 3 rounds on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, he was right up there with the leaders and with some of the lowest players across those three rounds. So fine, golf is golf. You can write off, throw 1 round, and just throw it in the trash. So had he done that same scoring in round one, he'd be a higher price and much higher ownership this week at the Sony. So
And we can easily
I'll
convince
get right
ourselves
back on that.
that that was just round one to knock off the rust from some time off during the winter, and that's how
Oh,
we'll.
of course. If it was a player I liked, Brian, of course that is correct. If it was a player I didn't like, well, then obviously he sucks.
Yes, that is exactly how PGA DFS works, guys. So that will do it for this video. Appreciate you watching. The daily plug will be up tonight or early tomorrow morning with Nero's selections, his lineup construction tips, as well as some other notes for the slate. Course breakdown. We don't go too much into course stuff here or weather, but if you want that information, Nero has it in the daily plug. The model that we've been referencing, that'll be up tonight with projected ownership, and our lineup builder that allows you to build up to 300 lineups on DraftKings or FanDuel using all the custom rules and our model inputs. That's up and is ready for every event of the season. So again, if you want to see these videos, like, subscribe to the channel, all free to do. Comment, also free to do, and watch all the way till the end. And if we get more than 1,000 viewers for each of the next few videos through January, we'll try to continue these videos for the rest of the season. So for Nero, I'm Brian. Thanks for listening, and good luck and enjoy the Sony Open this week.